Major support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. The South Carolina Ports Authority, a major economic driver in South Carolina, supporting 187,000 jobs and nearly $53 billion in annual economic activity. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, our unseasonably hot fall weather seems to be a metaphor for a similar situation in this economy. Right now, one of the longest economic expansions in contemporary history. And I'm not oversaying it. It doesn't look like it will be over anytime soon either. Welcome again to the longest running and the most widely watched source of Carolina business policy and public affairs here in our region. I am Chris William, and on this program, a look into the near future. What happens for the balance of this year? And how much further will our business activity continue to expand? And also, later, he is the president of the North Carolina Railroad. Scott Saylor joins us.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, an independent licensee of the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association. Visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Barings, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Christopher Chung of the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina, Peggy B. McLean, Economic Development Director of Kershaw County, and special guest Scott Saylor, President of North Carolina Railroad Company.
Hello, welcome to our program. Chris, Peggy, good to have you both back. Welcome. Thanks you very much.
Good to be here.
Chris, you know, so here we are post-Florence, you know, and it almost seemed one of the deadliest hurricanes for the South, arguably. Closing in on 50 people died from this hurricane. So I want to be careful about appearing flippant or minimize this at all. However, we got past this thing, this hurricane, and it seems like North Carolina, South Carolina took it in stride. I mean, we certainly had flooding, but it wasn't nearly covered after the fact. My question is this: there are still things that are going on around the hurricane. Mm-hmm. And one of the concerns is this thing called disaster worker crisis. And what I mean by that is we already have a very tight employment, low number. And now the issue is to find those workers willing to rebuild parts of the Carolinas, bridges, personal homes, roadways, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think this is going to be a pressure spot for the economy?
Well, I think we were talking earlier, of course, and that is the downside of this very hot economy that you started off speaking about, is it's leading to a lot of pressure in labor markets. I don't think a day goes by where we don't talk to companies that are in North Carolina, and they're finding it challenging to find workers, and I suspect it's the same exact thing across the border in South Carolina. That is what happens when you have unemployment at historically low levels because of a strong economy. And yes, no surprise that might affect some of the recovery effort post-Florence as you look at construction, rebuilding, all of that sort of thing. Is
it a worker shortage, Peggy? Is this the same problem in the Midlands and in South Carolina?
Oh, certainly. And we were in a building mode anyway. We recently passed some legislation that's helped us with our infrastructure improvements. And so, you know, the markets were tight for labor, and that's going to continue. But you know, it's just going to continue.
But and I'll use the Fed's words, or I'll use the Fed's observations. The Fed doesn't see any meaningful, some nominal, but any real meaningful wage inflation yet. When does it show up?
You know, I'm not sure. Definitely there are jobs out there for people who want to go to work and want to get involved in construction. And so whether they come from other parts of the country to the southeast, which is probably happening, I would say that's probably, you know, going on right now. So the southeast is attractive. We're going to get people. We're going to put them. We have the jobs, and we're going to put them to work.
Yeah, I think that the nice thing that we have going on, whether that's North Carolina or South Carolina, is people continue to in-migrate here from other parts of the country, which again continues to feed the talent pool that employers can draw from.
Does that bail us out, Chris? And I'll use the term. I mean, we can make some mistakes knowing very well that for the next year or 10 years that we're going to have a lot of folks moving in.
Well, it certainly puts us in a better position than a lot of other parts of the U.S. that we may compete with regularly for new investment. But you also got to, of course, have strong organic production of workforce from universities, from community colleges, and from K through 12. I was just at an event in Union County, just east of Charlotte here, and they're celebrating all their manufacturers and having all these manufacturers open their doors so that students, parents, teachers, guidance counselors can come in and see manufacturing, see it for what it is as a great career opportunity, hoping that's going to spur some of these kids to get into this as a career path. And closing that awareness gap of careers in manufacturing, I think that's going to help with the workforce issue long term.
And that's what we're doing. I'm in Kershaw County, South Carolina, and we're hosting an 8th grade manufacturing expo. And what we're doing is introducing manufacturing opportunities to our young people, so that they're thinking about them early on, or earlier than perhaps in the past, we've thought they were going to. But making them aware, and that's going to make a difference.
Now, that coming from an economic developer to an 8th grader is going to mean one thing. Can you get the coverage you need from guidance counselors at school to say the same thing?
Oh, certainly, because they're part of the effort as well. Like I said, we've got this 8th grade expo. I'm going to have probably 10 manufacturing companies with interactive displays so the kids can do hands-on things, but the guidance counselors are the ones that are bringing them. And we're telling them that you don't have to have a 4-year degree to be successful in life.
Does that make a sense to a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old?
Well, that's why the interactive part or component.
You hook them with that?
Yeah, you hook them with that. You get them so that they can do something, they can physically or manually, put something together and see that it has a product at the end. And that's how you gauge their interest.
And that's why you get the parents, the teachers, and the counselors in there too, because these are all very influential figures in helping children determine what they want to do with their lives. So exposing them as well to what manufacturing looks like, that's going to pay dividends.
To hear you two talk, you echo a little bit of the frustration that the technical college system and community college systems are facing when they cannot connect the kids and the students at that level to what they ought to be considering, besides just seeing the stretch. I want to go to a 4-year college or university. I don't want to go down that road. I want to change topics here a little bit.
It's a whole separate subject.
Yes.
A whole completely separate subject. Chris, do you think that, so here we are closing in on election season, do you think that most people voting have any idea what's at stake in the fall?
I'm not sure I understand that question. I mean, again, politics is such a very personal decision for a lot of people. I mean, from where we sit in the economic development world, I think, yes, there's probably some companies that are waiting to see what the outcome of the midterm elections looks like. We don't have a gubernatorial election in North Carolina, but of course, federal policy has a lot of effect on the business climate nationally, has a lot of effect on investment activity overall. So it's not unusual for us to see a little bit of a slowdown ahead of elections, whether it's the mid-year terms or the presidential years, just because they're waiting to see what's the composition of Congress going to be in terms of the impact on tax policy, regulatory policy, and all those things that spur or affect investment decisions.
South Carolina does have a gubernatorial election.
We do.
So a couple questions. Same question, Peggy. Do you get the sense that most voters in South Carolina realize what's at stake this year, and not just for a governor, but tax policy, et cetera, et cetera? And then the other thing, how would you handicap the governor's race? Who do you think is going to be, you think McMaster will keep the job, or will there be a newcomer?
I don't think McMaster has stubbed his toe. I think he handled the recent hurricane issue as a governor should, and so it's a long shot to have a Democrat come into the governor's mansion in South Carolina. However, you never know. I'm not going to predict a winner or a loser. McMaster has been very supportive of economic development, and I don't know that we'll see change, but the Department of Commerce, which is the economic development arm for the state, is very well poised either way.
Chris, in North Carolina, just last minute here, in North Carolina, there was a lot of talk about what an economic developer once called the worst kept secret in North Carolina was Apple. We don't hear much about Apple. What's going on with the relationship with Apple? Will they relocate to North Carolina with some of this business? And what is it?
You haven't heard much, and you won't hear much more on today's program, I'm afraid. I mean, as you can imagine, look, we're always in conversations with a lot of different companies. North Carolina has a strong value proposition across a lot of different industries. Of course, we have a lot of tough competition with states like South Carolina. We're very lucky that we continue to sit on a very active book of project opportunities looking at North Carolina. Everything from a few jobs in manufacturing in a rural area to thousands of jobs in one of our larger metropolitan markets. That is partly a function of a good economy. It's also partly a function of a pro-business climate that continues to be attractive to companies that are looking at where they grow. So we know that in due time we'll win our fair share, and we welcome all companies to do business in the state.
Do you, Peggy, do you think 2019 is going to continue good momentum as Chris described, the economic development projects?
Oh, I think so. I think from my perspective, we have a mega site, which is we've got 1,400 acres of one site that's available in Kershaw County, South Carolina. And so we get a lot of the large projects, and most of them are international. And so the United States is always going to be an attractive location for global companies.
Even in light of a trade and tariff dispute, as long as that might go on, that still doesn't take the wind out of your sails with that?
Oh, no,
No.
no.
Right.
In fact,
Isn't that
it
interesting?
encourages companies to locate facilities in the United
That's
States
right.
and in South Carolina or North Carolina.
Yeah, we're seeing the exact same thing with foreign interest in the state. Yep.
Okay, well, let's hope for it. It looks like it's going to happen. Thank you for being on the program. We're going to meet our guest in a moment. Coming up on this program next week, actually, he's the North Carolina Attorney General. His name's Josh Stein. He will be our guest. Also, not long down the road, right around the holidays, we welcome back to our program the chairwoman and CEO of Duke Energy. Lynn Good always has an interesting dialogue and never a shortage of news around Duke Energy. We're going to talk to Lynn Good more about that later on. No doubt we love our cars. Just look around. It's more of a rule than an exception when families have multiple cars. And the construction and traffic on surface roads is evident of that. But congestion works against us, both environmentally and economically, but also stressfully. Joining us now is the head of the North Carolina Railroad Company. His name is Scott Saylor, and we welcome back to the program. Hi, Scott.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Chris.
Scott, I almost don't know where to start, so let's start with Hurricane Florence. It was more than just a passing storm, but was quite a secular hit to North Carolina and the Carolinas and South Carolina. Scott, did the railroad sustain damage, and what do you see your role going forward as part of the rebuild effort?
We did sustain damage, about $2 million worth of damage to our railroad. On the Norfolk Southern system statewide, about $5 million, I understand, so order of magnitude pretty significant there. So our job is to make sure that railroad gets up and running again, and Norfolk Southern, under our long-term lease, takes care of that. So we had about 8 washouts where the rivers rising and creeks rising took out culverts or bridges, and it was restored in about 7 days. And that's the value of having a Class 1 railroad company with those resources to put it back together so that we can continue to serve the port in Morehead City, the 2 military installations in eastern North Carolina, and all the industries in that region.
Did you see firsthand some of that damage, the washouts?
Did?
What was it like?
Well, you see a track hanging over what was a culvert, and it will be completely open. So the rails typically are connected, and
And you had more than one of those?
quite a scene. We had about 8 of those, but the resources are there to put those back together, and this happens statewide. It's not just our railroad line, but there are a lot of private infrastructure projects like that that help for the future. We had already replaced a number of bridges on our line and reinforced those bridges. A major one over the Trent River was covered with water, and it was fine. We didn't have any damage to that particular bridge because we had done some restoration work a couple of years ago.
I'm assuming the Corps of Engineers goes back in, though, to stress test that bridge, even though it's new construction, and to certify more than anything else?
The railroads do, and
the
Coast
railroads
Guard.
do. Okay, yeah, thank you. Chris?
So, of course, doing economic development in North Carolina these past several years, it's been really great to see the North Carolina Railroad stepped up in a big way to get into the economic development game. I'm just kind of curious, being relatively new to North Carolina, it's only been 4 years, what spurred you all to take that strategic direction and become such a critical partner at the table?
Sure. Well, that original history, the creation of the North Carolina Railroad Company, was for economic development. The state initiated that 170 years ago, it's hard to believe, with $2 million of capital, and it was to create jobs in the state, and that is still what we are about. What happened in the last 25 years is that we renegotiated our agreement with Norfolk Southern, long-term leases. That created a new capital stream, and once we invested in our line to kind of bring it up to par, we found that we were able to invest statewide in specific economic development projects, particularly manufacturers looking for kind of that last mile for rail spur capability as part of incentive packages or infrastructure improvements for those customers. So for the last 18 months, we've been pretty heavily engaged in that. We've been involved in 8 project announcements. Most of those, Chris, you've been involved in, of course, and those have been great projects. Those projects total about $1.5 billion of capital investment by those companies that are rail served, and about 2,000 jobs.
But it's been great to have that major effort. I mean, it's a huge difference maker in the deals that we're pursuing at a state
Well,
level.
and I would say as a follow-up for that, Scott, excuse me, Peggy, just a quick follow-up. It seems like, and this is my term, Scott, but it would seem like the North Carolina Railroad Company, as it's formally called, is an honest broker, an agent for the state, as it has a relationship between CSX and Norfolk Southern and those transportation spurs. Is that accurate to say?
It is. It is. We are part of the industry, so it is a railroad company. We have the same rights and obligations as any railroad company, but most of our operations are under the long-term agreement with the Norfolk Southern. What that does, though, is it generates a capital stream, patient capital, we call it, so we can make investments for the long haul. What made a difference in that in the last couple of years is the legislature enacted some transformational project legislation to get North Carolina better in the game for large projects. You mentioned mega sites earlier, I know. That really enabled a lot of things to happen. And we're on the team. This economic development, of course, is a team sport. So we're kind of a newer player statewide on that team. And we'd like to think so far it's been pretty effective.
Peggy, sorry to cut in front of you. Please go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine. You know, we hear about some of the challenges in the trucking industry. You know, truck drivers and that. How is that impacting what you guys can offer or services y'all are providing to customers? Hopefully that means, you know, increased rail traffic. Are you seeing that?
It has, absolutely. Our rail volumes have gone up fairly dramatically in the past few years, particularly intermodal container service. I know you have a very active port in Charleston. North Carolina has a port of Wilmington. Container service is up, and the railroads are participating in that pretty heavily because that is a very time-sensitive, labor, as you said, cost-sensitive product to offer. And the railroads do benefit when those volumes go up the way they have recently. We see that volume on our railroad primarily between Greensboro and Charlotte. You have a new yard here in Charlotte, of course, on Norfolk Southern that supports that growth. And I think CSX as well has had similar growth in the state. And that's a great thing for the state. We're seeing that commerce, or the way I say it is our economy is moving in those trains that you see.
And it's not all long haul, Scott. I want to talk a little bit about the urban cores and some of the tracks that bisect, not exactly, but as we talked about before the program, there's a Wilmington line, or there's a line that goes through Wilmington that feeds the port, goes over the Cape Fear River, and that seems to be inconvenient for now what an urban core and traffic has become. That's not the only place. It happens in Columbia, it happens in Charlotte, it happens in the Triangle and the Triad. What is the strategy for railroads when you have to consider light rail, heavy rail, passenger traffic, freight traffic? How does that all change now in light of all of this new urban growth we've seen?
Creates a lot of opportunities for sharing corridors. So for example, in Charlotte, we shared 3 miles of our railroad with CATS to extend the light rail line. That is an old freight line, but it is still a freight line, and we like to protect it for that same purpose as well. And CATS worked with us very closely on that, great partners in that. And statewide, protecting that 200-foot wide corridor is a tough thing. We have, or the way I say that is we have 634 miles of neighbors. And that can be a challenge. The most important thing we did is that we started mapping and doing a full GIS system for all of our rail corridor about 10 years ago. And that's something railroads don't typically have. But what we found is we're now in a much better place to show folks where the boundaries are for the corridor, and encouraging those 40 cities and towns that we go through to kind of recognize that boundary and do setbacks and that sort of thing, so that we have that corridor for the future. We can do an amazing number of things with a fairly narrow piece of real estate as long as the integrity of it is in shape.
Glad you asked about passenger rail. I've actually used that Amtrak service a few times between Raleigh and Charlotte. It's a nice way to skip the drive on 85 if you ever get the chance. But I want to go back to mega sites. We were talking off camera before everything started about the ones that got away, Toyota Mazda being probably one of the biggest ones for North Carolina. We know, sitting where we do, you all were integral to why we even got late into that competition to be a finalist for that project. what were the biggest lessons that the railroad learned from that project in terms of what we could do to position ourselves better in the future to attract that kind of automotive assembly operation?
Yeah, a lot of lessons, I think, for us in that. There had not been an entity in the state that was ready and able to assemble. You know how difficult it is to assemble a mega site of multiple owners. So we have 4 mega sites in the state. One of those had not yet been assembled. The other 3 were assembled already. All of them are rail served, of course, as you said. It's so critical to that.
Currently now served by rail?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
all 4.
Yeah.
They are all 4 on Class 1 rail lines. And that's what you really need to be able to attract a large manufacturer. So we have worked on large projects for about 15 years. Mm-hmm. Mostly as a nominal partner or quiet partner, trying to help recruit, making sure our railroad's available. And what we concluded when we expanded our freight operation, or our NCR Invest program, to offer last mile capital for those projects, that megasites really are a part of that. Mm-hmm. And we've committed to all 4 of the state's megasites to provide the rail infrastructure for a transformational project when that occurs, and we think that it will.
Mm-hmm. Peggy?
And this is because I don't know a lot about how the rails operate, but going forward, I mean, what do you see as the future of your typical customers, or what do you see developments in rail? I mean, it's an old school kind of movement of transfer of goods. So what do you see kind of coming down the track, so to speak?
Stop it, you're killing me.
Well, I think you'll see increased container. I think you'll see that.
Okay.
Because of the
Can
pressures.
you go higher?
You can go 2 stack. You can do doubles.
Okay.
We're not doing triples, but you can double stack. So you can put a 150 car train on our railroad, which carries 300 containers. So that's 300 trucks that wouldn't move on the highway, mm-hmm. and wouldn't be bearing down the maintenance costs of highways and things. So the railroads are able to really benefit from that. The customers, faster moves. Mm-hmm. Our main line, part of the Norfolk Southern system, is carrying trains for UPS, FedEx. They're all moving by rail. So when you order from Amazon and you get that list of where your product is moving, it may not say rail, but when you see it jump from Hagerstown, Maryland to Atlanta, it probably moved on a train.
You know what, as I think about when we go back to the urban core issue, I want to ask you this question. I think of the triangle as it struggles with what light rail will look like between Durham, Chapel Hill, Raleigh, and all points in the triangle. Does, and not just the railroad company, Scott, but does heavy rail, does rail have a bully pulpit and a responsibility to help metros like the Triangle, like Charlotte, like the Low Country, et cetera, help them think a little bit more progressively about light rail, that it's not all about the return on investment, that if you put these rails, and I'm sounding like I'm prophesizing here a little bit, but how do you see your role in encouraging light rail in higher and higher density cities?
There are 2 ways. The first is to protect the corridor, to have it available to begin with in the first place. Our corridor is 200 feet wide. That is unusually wide. It's atypical. It's not 200 feet in every place, but in most places. So that allows us to do things like the CATS agreement for the light rail in North Charlotte. But most lines are narrower than that. So most of the lines coming in and out of Charlotte or Raleigh or Columbia would be 100 foot wide typically, or 120 foot wide corridors. That really gives us an advantage as long as we can protect that corridor. The other I think piece of that answer to that question would be it is a very capital intensive business. You have to spend mm-hmm. very wisely. It takes a year or 2 just to engineer a bridge or 2, and folks forget that part too. So if you're double tracking or triple tracking or adding commuter rail, it's easy to do when you have nice, clean, flat right of way, mm-hmm. but we don't always have that. So if we need to cross the Yadkin River or a major highway, you've got to build bridges, and those can be expensive.
And we have about a minute left. Sorry, Chris, but I want to wrap it up with Scott here. So we have about a minute left. Does that preclude? I know there's been some private equity sniffing around about building a rail line from Charlotte to Atlanta, maybe Raleigh, Charlotte to Atlanta, mm-hmm. Up through the upstate of South Carolina. Does that preclude more private dollars chasing it down because it's so capital intensive on the front end?
It definitely does. I think you're seeing that private equity investments in places like Florida. And I think the companies in that area are trying to grow that a little bit. but it still requires substantial capital and I would say public investment for those to occur. There's not a profit-making railroad, passenger railroad in the United States.
So it has to be institutional or governmental of some sort?
That would be my view.
Yeah, going forward.
It does.
Yeah, thank you for being on the program. So the last time we were trying to figure out was when you were still publicly traded to some degree, 15 or 20 years ago. I'm glad you still got the job.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming back.
It's been a good ride.
No pun intended.
No pun.
Thanks, Scott. Peggy, welcome. Always good to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Chris, thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Chris.
Nice to see you. Thank you for watching our program. If you have any questions or comments, carolinabusinessreview.org. Long name, but it'll be worth it. Thank you for watching. Have a good weekend. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by the Duke Endowment, Barings, Grant Thornton, the South Carolina Ports Authority, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.